Memory is a curious thing. It pools like water in the hollows of time, reflecting not what was, but what we needed it to be. I have had centuries to consider this, centuries to watch the stories of my life reshape themselves like clouds across an endless sky. What remains true? What was legend from the very beginning? Perhaps that distinction matters less than I once believed. I remember the weight of a sword in my hand, though I cannot say if it was pulled from stone or given by a lady beneath dark waters. Both feel equally real to me now. What I know with certainty is the ache in my shoulders after long days of training, the way leather grips grew soft and familiar against my palms, the particular silence that falls over a field before battle, not empty, but full of held breath. My name was Arthur, but I was not always a king. I was born in winter, though in which year I cannot say. Time moved differently then, measured not in numbered years, but in the rhythm of seasons, the lives and deaths of those we loved. Snow fell the night I drew my first breath, or so I was told later, and the midwife said the flakes were unusually large, like torn pieces of parchment scattered by an invisible hand. Perhaps the gods were already writing my story in the sky. I remember my mother's hands, Igraine's hands, though I knew them only briefly. They were pale and soft, with rings that caught what little light filtered through the heavy curtains of her chamber. She would trace the lines of my face with one finger while she hummed melodies I can still recall, wordless songs that seemed to come from some deep well of sorrow. There was always sadness in her eyes, even when she smiled. Perhaps she knew, even then, what I would become, what I would lose, what the price of my becoming would be. The castle where I spent my earliest years was built on a hill that caught the wind from all directions. In summer, that wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh hay. In winter, it brought the sharp bite of snow and the promise of harder days ahead. I would stand at the window of the nursery, my breath fogging the glass, and watch the world change color with the seasons, green to gold, to white to green again, an endless cycle that seemed to promise that nothing truly ended, only transformed. The stones of that place were old even then, worn smooth by centuries of weather, darkened by smoke from countless fires. When I pressed my ear against them, I could sometimes hear the echo of voices from years past, conversations held in languages I did not recognize, laughter and weeping layered like sediment in rock. The stones remembered everything, I thought. They had witnessed the birth and death of dynasties, the rise and fall of civilizations. Somehow, this comforted me. Sir Ector raised me as his own, and I loved him for it. He was a good man, not a great one, perhaps, but good in the way that matters most. He taught me to ride before I could properly walk, holding me steady in the saddle while his old war-horse plodded patiently around the courtyard. The smell of horses became my earliest comfort. Warm hide and leather, oats and hay, the particular musk of a stable in morning light. Kay, his son, was my brother in all but blood. We shared everything in those days, secrets whispered after dark, bruises earned in mock battles with wooden swords, the bitter taste of ale stolen from the servants' quarters. He had freckles across his nose and a laugh that could shake leaves from trees. I envied him sometimes, for he would never carry a crown, never know the weight of a kingdom's hopes. He would be allowed to remain simply human. The first time I held a real sword, I was 12 years old. The blade was longer than my arm and heavy enough that I could barely lift it properly. But when the metal touched my palm, something stirred in my chest. Recognition, perhaps, or destiny making itself known. The sword hummed, almost inaudibly, as if it were singing to something deep in my bones. Sir Ector watched me with careful eyes, and I saw him exchange a look with the weapon master that I did not understand then, though I think I understand it now. Training began in earnest after that. Dawn to dusk, I learned the language of steel, not just how to swing a blade, but how to read an opponent's intentions in the set of his shoulders, how to move so that armor became an extension of skin rather than a burden, how to find the balance point between aggression and patience. My hands grew calloused, my arms ached constantly, and I fell asleep each night to the phantom weight of sword and shield. But it was not just martial skills they taught me. There were lessons in letters and numbers, in the histories of the kingdoms that sprawled across our island like pieces of a broken mosaic. I learned the names of kings who had ruled before me, their victories and failures, the ways their choices had shaped the world I would inherit. History, I discovered, was not a series of events, but a river, always flowing, always changing, carrying the debris of past decisions into an uncertain future. The tutors spoke of honor as if it were a simple thing, a bright line between right and wrong. But even as a boy, I sensed the complications hidden in their certainties. What did you owe to a friend who asked you to lie? What did you do when justice for one meant injustice for another? These questions settled in my mind like seeds in fertile soil, growing more complex with each passing season. Winter evenings were spent by the great hearth, listening to the bards spin their tales of heroes and monsters, of quests undertaken and prices paid. The firelight danced across their faces as they spoke, and their voices rose and fell like music. They sang of warriors who never knew defeat, of kingdoms that lasted forever, of love that conquered death itself. I drank in these stories like wine, never imagining that someday my own name would be woven into such tales, changed and embellished until the man I knew myself to be would disappear beneath layers of legend. The stones of Camelot were pale gold in morning light, grey-green in rain. I watched them change color countless times from the window of what would become my chamber. As a boy, during my first visit to that place, I pressed my face against the cold glass and traced patterns in the condensation with my finger. Spirals mostly, endless circles that led nowhere and everywhere at once. I did not know then that this would become the shape of my life, that I would spend my years chasing my own tail, trying to build something permanent in a world that insisted on change. The great hall could hold 500 people when filled for feast days, but it felt intimate somehow, perhaps because of the way the ceiling curved overhead, like the hull of an upturned ship. Tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting scenes of hunt and harvest, of seasons turning and crops growing. In winter, when the winds howled outside, the hall became a world unto itself, warm and bright, and full of human voices raised in song and story. I remember the smell of roasting meat on festival days, the way it mingled with wood smoke and beeswax from the candles. Servants moved between the tables like dancers, their arms laden with platters and pitchers, their faces flushed from the heat of the kitchens. Musicians played from the gallery above, their instruments weaving melodies that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of conversation below. But it was in the quieter moments that Camelot revealed its true character. Early morning, when mist clung to the courtyards, and the only sounds were the soft footfalls of servants beginning their daily tasks. Late evening, when the last of the candles guttered in their holders, and shadows claimed the corners where light could not reach. These were the times when the castle felt most real to me, most like home. The weight of a crown is not what you might imagine. It is not heavy, not physically. A circlet of gold weighs less than a helmet, considerably less than chain mail, certainly less than the expectations of a kingdom. But it changes the way people look at you, and eventually it changes the way you see yourself. I learned to hold my head differently, to speak more slowly, to measure my laughter. A king's joy, I discovered, must be rationed like grain in winter, doled out carefully, lest it seem inappropriate or excessive. The coronation took place on a day when the sun seemed to shine more brightly than it had any right to, given the season. I remember the weight of the ceremonial robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, the way they rustled when I moved. The crown itself was ancient, worn by kings whose names had been forgotten even then. When the archbishop placed it on my head, I felt the accumulated hopes of generations settling on my shoulders like snow. The cheering of the crowd was like the roar of the sea, overwhelming and constant. Faces blurred together in my vision, some familiar, some strange, all turned toward me with expressions of expectation that I was not sure I could fulfill. In that moment, I understood that Arthur the boy had died, and Arthur the king had been born. It was a birth as painful and necessary as any other. I fell in love with a woman whose hair caught light like spun copper threads. Guinevere. Even now, the sound of her name is like water over stones, smooth, musical, inevitable. She laughed at my jokes before I was king, when I was still just a young man who happened to be handy with a sword and had an unfortunate tendency toward grand gestures. Her laughter was like silver bells, bright and clear and utterly without artifice. Later she would smile instead of laugh, and later still, she would look away when I attempted humor at all. Crowns, I learned, are not conducive to intimacy. She came from the western kingdoms, where the hills rolled like green waves, and the sea mist carried the scent of salt and possibility. Her father's castle was built on a cliff overlooking the water, and she told me once that she had spent her childhood watching the tides come and go, marking time by their rhythm rather than by any human clock. Perhaps that was why she always seemed slightly out of step with the rest of the world, as if she moved to music that only she could hear. She smelled of lavender and something else, something I could never name. Wild honey, perhaps, or the air after rain, or the particular fragrance of roses just beginning to bloom. When she walked through the great hall, conversations would pause, not because she demanded attention, but because joy seemed to follow in her wake like perfume. She had a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel as though your words were the most important sounds in the world. I courted her in the old way, with songs and flowers and declarations that seemed poetic at the time, but embarrass me now in their earnestness. I wrote her letters that filled entire sheets of parchment, with elaborate praise for her eyes, her voice, her grace. She saved them all, I learned later, though she teased me mercilessly about their purple prose. "You write like a man who has read too many stories," she said once, "and not enough life." She was right, of course. She was right about most things. Our wedding was a celebration that lasted 3 days and drew guests from every corner of the known world. The great hall had never held so many people, and additional pavilions were erected in the courtyards to accommodate the overflow. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the fragrance of flowers brought from distant gardens. Musicians played from dawn until deep into the night, and even the servants seemed to dance as they went about their duties. I remember the weight of her hand in mine as we spoke our vows. The way her voice trembled slightly on the words that would bind us together for all the years to come. She wore white silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and a circlet of silver set with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. When I kissed her, the crowd erupted in cheers so loud they seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. But it was the quieter moments of our early marriage that I treasure most. The way she would hum while she embroidered, creating melodies that seemed to spring from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound of her laughter when she caught me practicing speeches to the mirror, trying to find the right words for some diplomatic crisis or another. The warmth of her body beside mine in the great bed, her breathing slow and steady in the darkness while I lay awake, wondering if I was worthy of such happiness. She had a garden that she tended herself, refusing all offers of help from the castle's gardeners. It was not large, but it was perfectly arranged, with herbs and flowers placed according to some design that existed only in her mind. She would spend hours there, her hands deep in the rich earth, coaxing life from seeds and cuttings. Growing things, she told me once, is the closest we can come to magic in this world. She was working in that garden the first time I saw her with child, one hand pressed to her still flat belly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. We lost that child before it could draw breath, and 3 others after that. Each loss carved something out of us, left us a little more hollow, a little more careful with hope. I would find her sometimes in the garden, tears streaking her cheeks as she tended plants that would bloom and flourish and die in their season, as all living things must. We never spoke of what might have been, but the silence between us grew heavy with unspoken grief. I lost her, of course. Not to death. That would have been simpler, cleaner somehow. I lost her to the very thing that brought us together. My need to be more than just a man. A king cannot have what a man might have. A king shares his heart with a kingdom, and kingdoms are hungry, jealous things that devour whatever love is not offered to them freely. The round table was built from oak that had stood for 300 years before we felled it. The carpenter who shaped it wept as he worked, he told me later, for the tree had been ancient and beautiful, and it seemed a kind of murder to cut it down. But the wood still held the memory of its growing. I could feel it sometimes when I placed my palms flat against its surface. The grain swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the tree had spent centuries preparing for this particular purpose. Circles again. No head, no foot, no beginning or end. It seemed like wisdom at the time, this rejection of hierarchy in favor of equality. Perhaps it was. But circles can be prisons as easily as they can be symbols of unity, and I learned too late that some kinds of order are necessary, even if they are not perfect. The knights who gathered around that table were the finest men I ever knew, and also the most flawed. They came to Camelot, carrying their own stories of loss and longing, their own quests for meaning, in a world that seemed increasingly meaningless. Some sought redemption for past sins. Others sought simply to belong to something larger than themselves. All of them, I think, were trying to become worthy of the legends that were already beginning to grow around them. I remember the sound of rain on the castle roof during the long councils, the way it drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, the way candlelight would flicker and dance, casting our shadows large and wavering on the stone walls. We looked like giants in those shadows, like gods, perhaps, capable of reshaping the world through will alone. But gods, I think, do not grow tired. Gods do not feel the particular ache that comes from making decisions that will outlive you, that will echo through history long after you are dust. We tried to build something that had never existed before, a kingdom ruled by justice rather than force, by law rather than whim. It was a beautiful dream, and like all beautiful dreams, it was doomed from the moment we dared to speak it aloud. The world is not ready for perfection, I learned. Perhaps it never will be. But that does not mean the attempt is worthless. It means only that the attempt is the thing itself, the quest more important than any grail we might hope to find at its end. Merlin told me once that power is like fire, useful, necessary, but always hungry for more fuel. I thought I understood him then, but I was young and drunk on possibility. I believed that power could be contained, directed, made to serve good purposes without corrupting those who wielded it. I did not yet know that power changes not just what you can do, but what you must do. It creates its own necessities, demands its own sacrifices. The old wizard smelled of herbs and wood smoke, and his eyes held depths I never learned to fathom. They were ancient eyes, older than his face, older perhaps than time itself. He would appear at the strangest moments, never when I summoned him, always when I most desperately needed him. His voice was like distant thunder, promising storms that might never come, or might come tomorrow, or might already be upon us without our knowing. He told me stories of older times, when magic moved openly through the world like sunlight through leaves, when the boundaries between what was real and what was possible were as thin as morning mist. He spoke of dragons that slept beneath mountains, of forests where trees whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen, of islands beyond the western sea where time moved differently and death was only another kind of dreaming. I envied him sometimes, the way he could disappear when the weight of the world grew too heavy, the way he could step sideways out of responsibility and reappear when and where he chose. Kings cannot vanish, even when they most wish to. Kings must remain, must endure, must be present for every crisis and celebration, every birth and death, every moment when their people need them to be more than human. But I loved him too, for the way he saw possibility, where others saw only limitation, for the way he believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. He was father and friend and teacher all at once, and when he finally faded from my life, not all at once, but gradually, like morning mist burned away by the rising sun, I felt as though half my soul had gone with him. The betrayals came slowly, like seasons changing, so gradually that I did not recognize them until it was too late to prevent them. First, small things, a knight arriving late to council, another taking longer than necessary to answer a summons. Then larger cracks appeared in the foundation of trust we had built so carefully, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, glances exchanged between men who had once looked only to me for guidance. I felt each betrayal like a physical pain, a tearing in my chest that never quite healed. Not because I had expected perfection from those around me. I knew better than that, having discovered my own capacity for failure. But because each betrayal was also a kind of death, the death of the dream we had shared, the vision of what we might become together. Lancelot was the finest knight I ever knew, and the one who broke my heart most completely. Not because he loved my queen. Love is not a sin, whatever the priests might say. And I had seen the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, Their love was pure and painful and entirely beyond their control. No, he broke my heart because he could not forgive himself for it. His honor became a weapon he turned against all of us, sharp and unforgiving. He was beautiful in the way that heroes are supposed to be beautiful, tall and strong and graceful, with eyes like winter sky, and hands that could gentle a frightened horse or wield a sword with equal skill. When he rode into battle, he seemed to glow with some inner light, as if the very air around him had been touched by something divine. Women wept when they saw him pass, and men followed him into hopeless fights simply because he asked them to. But I knew him in quieter moments too, when the armor was set aside and the crowd had dispersed. I knew the way he worried at problems like a dog with a bone, turning them over and over in his mind until he found some flaw in his own reasoning. I knew how he blamed himself for every casualty in battle, every plan that went awry, every moment when he fell short of the impossible standards he set for himself. He loved Guinevere with the kind of devotion that burns like a fever, consuming everything in its path. And she loved him with equal intensity, though she tried for years to deny it, to convince herself that duty was stronger than desire. I watched them struggle against their feelings, watched them tear themselves apart rather than betray me. And I wanted to tell them that I would have gladly given them my blessing if it would have brought peace to any of us. But peace was the one thing none of us could accept. We were too proud, too bound by codes of honor that had become chains, too afraid of what it might mean to admit that our perfect kingdom was built on foundations as fragile as any other. So we maintained the fiction, all of us, until it became impossible to tell where truth ended and performance began. The affair, when it finally began, was like a wildfire in drought season, swift and destructive and impossible to contain once it had started. I do not know when exactly it began, though I suspect it was during the summer when I was away on campaign in the northern kingdoms. I returned to find the castle changed in ways I could not name, the air thick with secrets and guilt. I chose not to see what was in front of me. I told myself that I was being wise, that some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. But wisdom and cowardice can look remarkably similar from the inside, and I have had centuries to consider which one guided my actions in those dark days. The discovery, when it came, was both shocking and inevitable. I found them in the garden she had tended so carefully, among the roses that were just beginning to bloom. They were not touching, but they did not need to be. The space between them hummed with electricity, and their faces held the particular glow that comes only from deep and mutual recognition. They saw me at the same moment, and the look in their eyes, guilt and defiance and desperate love all mingled together, told me everything I needed to know. I should have been angry. Rage would have been simpler, cleaner. Instead, I felt a kind of emptiness, as if something essential had been hollowed out of me. They were my wife and my dearest friend, and they loved each other with a purity that shamed the complicated affection I bore for both of them. How could I hate them for finding in each other what I had failed to give them myself? But kingdoms cannot run on understanding and forgiveness. Kingdoms require justice, or at least the appearance of justice. The law was clear, had been clear since the founding of Camelot. Adultery, especially the adultery of a queen, was treason. Treason was punishable by death. I had written these laws myself, believing in my youth that clear rules would make difficult decisions easier. I remember the trial as a kind of waking nightmare. The great hall, where we had celebrated so many victories, filled with hostile whispers and averted eyes. Guinevere standing before the judgment seat in white robes, her head held high despite the tears that streaked her cheeks. Lancelot absent, having fled the kingdom, rather than face charges that we all knew would result in his execution. She did not deny the accusations. She stood in the dock like a queen still, dignified in her guilt, and spoke only to say that she regretted the pain her actions had caused me, but not the love that had driven them. The assembled nobles muttered among themselves, some calling for mercy, others for swift justice, all of them watching me to see what kind of king I would prove to be when tested by the deepest betrayal. I sentenced her to death because the law demanded it, because a kingdom that does not enforce its own laws cannot long survive. But I also arranged for her escape, sending word to Lancelot through channels I knew he would trust. Let him rescue her, I thought. Let them find happiness somewhere beyond my borders, beyond the reach of laws that had proven too rigid for the complexities of human hearts. The rescue came at dawn, swift and violent, and exactly as I had foreseen. Lancelot and his followers stormed the execution ground with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. In the chaos that followed, innocent men died. Good men, loyal men, men who had believed in the dream of Camelot and paid for that belief with their blood. I watched from the castle walls as they rode away, my queen and my dearest friend, disappearing into the morning mist like figures from a story I had once read but could no longer fully remember. Part of me rode with them, I think, the part that had believed in happy endings, in the possibility of redemption, in the power of love to heal the wounds that justice could only deepen. The kingdom began to fracture after that, not all at once, but slowly, like ice breaking up in spring. The knights of the Round Table chose sides, some following Lancelot into exile, others remaining loyal to a king who had shown himself capable of both mercy and ruthlessness. The careful balance we had maintained for so many years was gone, replaced by suspicion and competing loyalties. Mordred came to me during this time of weakness, presenting himself as a solution to problems he had helped to create. My son, though I had not acknowledged him as such, had pretended even to myself that the resemblance between us was mere coincidence. He had his mother's dark eyes, and something of her hunger for power. But there was something of me in him too, a particular kind of idealism that had been twisted into bitterness by years of neglect and denial. He was clever, I will give him that. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a reformer, speaking of the need for new leadership, for a king who could unite the fractured kingdom under a single banner. He gathered around him those who had grown disillusioned with my rule, those who blamed me for the chaos that had followed Guinevere's trial. He spoke of justice and renewal, and many who heard him believed that he offered the kingdom's best hope for healing. I should have seen the trap closing around me, should have recognized the careful way he maneuvered pieces on the board of politics and loyalty. But I was tired, bone-deep weary in a way that sleep could not cure. The weight of years and mistakes and necessary compromises had settled on my shoulders like a cloak of lead. Sometimes I found myself wishing that someone else would take up the burden, that I could lay down the crown and disappear into the anonymity I had lost so long ago. The rebellion, when it came, split the kingdom down the middle. Brother fought brother, father fought son, and the green fields of Britain ran red with the blood of men who had once called each other friend. I led my forces into battle with a heavy heart, knowing that victory would be as bitter as defeat, that whatever the outcome, The dream of Camelot was already dead. War is not glorious, despite what the songs might say. War is cold mornings and empty saddles, letters that will never be delivered, and the particular sound a man makes when he realizes he is dying far from home. War is mud and blood, and the way crows gather after battle, growing fat on the flesh of heroes and villains alike. It is the heaviness that settles in your bones and never entirely leaves, the weight of all the lives you have taken and failed to save. I remember the last time I saw Camelot whole and beautiful, before the war came to our gates. It was evening, and the setting sun turned the white towers rose gold and amber. Cooking smoke rose straight up in the still air, and I could hear laughter from the courtyard below, the sound of children playing some game that involved much running and shouting. I stood at my window and tried to memorize that moment, sensing somehow that I would need to carry it with me for a very long time. The siege that followed was brutal and prolonged. Camelot had been built to withstand assault, its walls thick and its position commanding. But walls cannot hold against betrayal from within, and there were those in the castle who had already given their loyalty to Mordred. The city fell not to force of arms but to treachery, and I found myself fleeing the home I had spent a lifetime building. The final battle came not with trumpets and banners, but with mist and the smell of iron in the air. Camlan, they called it afterward, though I do not think it had a name before we made it famous with our blood. The field was quiet, except for the sound of steel against steel, the labored breathing of horses, the soft whisper of arrows finding their marks. I remember the way my sword felt in my hand that last time, familiar as my own heartbeat, heavy with the weight of all the lives it had taken and failed to save. The blade was notched and scarred from years of use, no longer the bright thing it had been when I first drew it from stone or water or whatever source had given it to me. Like its wielder, it had grown old in service. Mordred came for me as I knew he would, cutting through the press of battle with the single-minded determination of a man who has found his purpose at last. He was magnificent in his fury, terrible and beautiful like a storm at sea. When our swords met for the first time, the sound rang out across the battlefield, like a bell tolling the end of an age. We fought as if we were dancing, moving through the steps of a dance we had both learned in some other life. He was young and strong and driven by a hatred that gave him speed and power. I was older, wearier, but I had experience on my side, and perhaps something more, the knowledge that some fights are worth losing if they serve a greater purpose. In the end, we killed each other, as I think we both knew we would. My spear found his heart, just as his sword pierced my side, and we fell together in the mud and blood of that terrible field. His last words were, "Father," spoken not in anger, but in something that might have been forgiveness, or perhaps just the recognition of what we had always been to each other, beneath all the politics and betrayal. I died as I had lived, trying to hold things together that were determined to fall apart. There is a certain poetry in that, I suppose, though poetry is cold comfort when you lie bleeding on ground that tastes of salt and sorrow. The mist closed around me like a shroud, and the sounds of battle faded to whispers, then to silence. But death, I discovered, is not an ending. It is a doorway, a passage from one kind of being to another. The stories people tell about you after you are gone become as real as the life you actually lived. Perhaps more real, for they are freed from the constraints of truth, allowed to grow and change as the needs of the world require. I have watched my legend spread like ripples on a pond, each retelling changing me slightly, emphasizing different aspects of my story, adding new details that feel true even if they never happened. In some versions, I am a perfect king who never knew defeat. In others, I am a tragic figure brought low by the failings of those around me. All of these stories are true in their way. All of them are necessary. From this place beyond time, I can see the threads that connect all the Arthur stories, the way they weave together to create something larger than any single narrative. I am the king who pulled a sword from stone, and I am also the boy who wondered if he was worthy of such a destiny. I am the husband who lost his wife to his best friend, and I am also the man who chose forgiveness over vengeance. I am the leader who built a shining city, and I am also the one who watched it burn. They say I will return when the need is greatest, when the darkness grows too deep and the people cry out for a savior. But I think I never left. I am in every act of courage that costs more than it gives, in every attempt to build something beautiful in an ugly world, in every heart that chooses hope when wisdom counsels despair. I am in the rain that falls on new planted seeds, in the light that catches on water, in the silence between the ending of one story and the beginning of the next. The round table still stands somewhere, in some form, wherever people gather as equals to solve the problems that divide them. Camelot exists every time someone chooses to build rather than destroy, to forgive rather than seek revenge, to love in the face of loss. The quest for the Grail continues in every search for meaning, for purpose, for something holy in a world that often seems devoid of holiness. I was a king who tried to be a good man in a world that did not always reward goodness. I was a man who discovered that goodness is not enough, but that it is still worth attempting. I learned that legends are built not from perfection, but from the beautiful failure of perfect intentions. I found that love multiplied is not love diminished, that power shared is not power lost, that hope given away freely returned sevenfold. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes that cost lives and kingdoms and dreams. I trusted too little and too much, loved too carefully and too freely, tried to be human and king at the same time, without understanding that these roles could not be perfectly reconciled. But I also did some good in my time. I built something that lasted, if not in stone then in story. I showed that power could serve justice, that strength could serve mercy, that even failure could serve hope. The mist is lifting now, and I can see the shores of the place beyond time, where all stories eventually lead and all questions find their answers. The trees there are always in bloom, and the light never fades, and there are no more choices to make that will echo through eternity. It is peaceful here, though I confess I sometimes miss the weight of decisions, the necessity of hope, the privilege of failure that belongs to those who still draw breath. From this place, I can see all the Arthur stories spreading out like branches of a great tree, each one reaching toward light in its own way. Some are true to the man I remember being, captured in amber moments of joy and sorrow. Some are truer than truth, embodying the dreams and needs of the people who tell them. All of them are necessary, for they carry forward not the facts of one life, but the dream of what life might be, what kingdoms might become, what we might dare to build together if we have courage enough to try. The stories will continue long after these words fade, growing and changing as all living things must. New tellers will add new chapters, new meanings, new possibilities. Arthur will become whatever the world needs him to be, symbol of lost glory or hope for future redemption, cautionary tale or inspiring legend. This is as it should be. This is what it means to become myth, to serve purposes larger than any single life could contain. And perhaps, in the end, that is enough. Perhaps it is more than enough. Perhaps it is everything. My name was King Arthur.